There is a kind of betrayal that doesn't feel sharp at first. It doesn't scream or explode. It settles quietly, like a truth you weren't supposed to notice, and waits for you to look away. Mine came wrapped in laughter, the sound of my best friend's laugh echoing through my own living room, the same room where I had built a marriage brick by brick for nearly 4 decades. The night I understood what was happening, I didn't confront anyone. I didn't cry. I didn't even move. I sat there holding a glass of water I never drank, watching the two people I trusted most in the world exchange a look they thought no one saw. That look didn't belong to friendship or marriage. It belonged to secrecy, to choice. And in that moment, something inside me shifted, not into rage, but into clarity. My name is Margaret Hale. I am 63 years old and I live in a quiet coastal town in Oregon, the kind of place people describe as safe and peaceful. I was married for 38 years to a man everyone admired, steady career, polite manners, dependable smile. And for just as long, I had a best friend named Linda, the kind of woman people called loyal without ever questioning what that loyalty truly meant. She knew everything about my life, my fears, my habits, my blind spots. She had been in my home during holidays, illnesses, celebrations. She had cried on my couch. And if you're listening to this right now, before we go any further, tell me where you're listening from, your city or state, in the comments. Because what happened to me doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in ordinary homes between ordinary people when trust becomes invisible. I didn't suspect betrayal because there were no obvious signs. My husband didn't change overnight. My friend didn't suddenly disappear. They didn't grow careless or reckless. They grew comfortable. And comfort, I would later learn, is where the most dangerous decisions are made. That night, as their laughter filled the room and I quietly observed the way their bodies leaned toward each other without awareness, I understood something devastating and powerful at the same time. They believed I was harmless. They believed my silence was ignorance. They believed that if the truth ever surfaced, I would collapse under it. What they never considered, what they never planned for, was that I might choose patience over confrontation and strategy over emotion. And that decision would change everything. Once the idea settled in my mind, it refused to leave. I didn't obsess over it, not in the way people imagine betrayal consumes you. Instead, I observed. I watched how Linda suddenly knew my husband's schedule better than I did, how she would casually mention his meetings before he ever brought them up. I noticed how my husband began volunteering to run errands he had avoided for years. Always at the same times, Linda seemed mysteriously unavailable. These were not coincidences. They were patterns, and patterns are honest if you give them enough time. I didn't confront them because confrontation would have given them control over the narrative. Instead, I allowed them to continue believing they were careful. And in that belief, they became sloppy. What hurt most wasn't the affair itself, it was the entitlement. The way they spoke around me, never to me. The way they discussed future plans with subtle exclusions like I was already gone. I had become background noise in my own life. And yet, they still depended on me for stability, for finances, for credibility. That was the irony. While they were planning a future without me, they were still standing on the foundation I had built. Every mortgage payment, every shared account, every legal protection. They assumed love made me blind. They didn't realize love had made me precise. I started preparing quietly, reviewing documents late at night, remembering conversations I dismissed years ago as harmless. By the time I accepted the truth fully, I wasn't broken. I was ready. The confirmation didn't come from a confession or a careless message left open on a phone. It came from something far more revealing: routine. One afternoon, Linda showed up unannounced, as she had hundreds of times before, but this time she walked through my front door with a familiarity that no longer belonged to friendship. She moved through the house like it was already hers, setting her purse on the table, commenting on a picture I had recently moved, asking, without thinking, where he was, not how he was. Not if he was home, just where. And in that single word, I saw it clearly. She wasn't visiting me anymore. She was checking on her other life. I watched her closely as we talked, how her eyes drifted down the hallway toward the bedroom, how she used my husband's favorite phrases without realizing it, how she spoke about future plans with a confidence that didn't belong to someone on the outside. When my husband arrived later that evening, the shift between them was almost imperceptible, but only to those who weren't looking for it. A pause that lasted half a second too long. A shared glance quickly corrected. Attention disguised as politeness. I excused myself early that night, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I finally understood the full shape of the betrayal. This wasn't a secret romance fueled by impulse. This was coordination, planning, rehearsal. They weren't waiting to see if I would notice. They were waiting for me to disappear quietly. And in that moment, standing alone in my bedroom with the door closed, I realized something that steadied me completely. They were not stealing my husband from me. They were stealing my assumed silence. And once I reclaimed that, they would have nothing left to stand on. From that day forward, I began to see my life from the outside, as if I were studying a case rather than living it. Detachment does something remarkable. It strips emotion down to usefulness. I stopped asking my husband questions whose answers no longer mattered. I stopped sharing details of my day. I stopped filling the silence he created. Instead, I listened. I listened to the way he spoke about money, about timing, about how things would be easier soon. I listened to Linda's sudden confidence, the way she talked about the future with language that assumed inevitability. And slowly, quietly, I understood their plan. They weren't just having an affair. They were preparing a transition. A clean one, they thought. One where I would be left confused, embarrassed, grateful for whatever scraps of dignity they allowed me to keep. What they didn't realize was that every assumption they made about me was based on an outdated version of who I was. I began organizing my affairs the same way I had organized my life for decades, methodically, without announcement. I reviewed our shared assets. I revisited agreements I had signed years earlier without question. I sought advice framed as curiosity, not suspicion. And with every conversation, every document, every quiet adjustment, my position strengthened. I wasn't acting out of spite. I was correcting an imbalance. There is a moment in every long betrayal when the person being deceived realizes they now know more than the deceivers. That moment is powerful. It gives you options, and I chose mine carefully. By the time Linda started speaking openly about new beginnings, and my husband grew impatient with the routines that had once anchored him, I was no longer reacting. I was deciding. The wedding announcement came sooner than I expected, and when it did, it arrived wrapped in politeness. My husband sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where we had signed loan papers, planned vacations, and comforted each other through losses, and told me he wanted a divorce done respectfully. He spoke as if this were a business meeting, his tone measured, his words rehearsed. He said there was someone else, as if numbing it would make it smaller. He said he wanted a clean transition, as if cleanliness were something you could claim after years of deception. And then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned that Linda and he planned to marry once things were settled. I nodded. I thanked him for his honesty. I told him I wanted peace, not conflict. He exhaled with visible relief. In that moment, I saw exactly how he understood me, not as a woman capable of response, but as an obstacle that could be managed with calm language and lowered expectations. What he didn't know was that settled meant something very different to me. While they were planning vows and venues, I was finalizing protections. While they imagined a future financed by familiarity and shared history, I was ensuring that history could not be used against me. I let them believe I was gracious. I let them believe I was resigned. I even attended a small gathering where Linda spoke openly about new chapters, her voice steady, her smile practiced. I watched her closely, not with jealousy, but with curiosity. She had mistaken access for ownership, proximity for power. They both had. And in doing so, they walked willingly into a future that looked promising on the surface but rested on legal and financial ground that no longer belonged to them. My silence wasn't surrender. It was timing. I let the wedding happen. That part surprises people when they hear my story, and I understand why. They expect resistance, a last-minute revelation, some dramatic interruption designed to reclaim dignity in public. But dignity, I learned, doesn't require an audience. It requires precision. I signed the divorce papers without argument, exactly when advised, exactly how planned. I wished them well with a calm that unsettled even me. Linda hugged me afterward, whispering something about gratitude and forgiveness, as if she were doing me a favor by stepping into the life I had built. I smiled and returned the gesture, noting how tightly she held on, how much reassurance she needed from someone she believed she had already defeated. What neither of them understood was that the future they were celebrating had already been rewritten, quietly, legally, and irreversibly. You see, love stories don't survive well under scrutiny, but contracts do. The assets they assumed would carry them forward had protections they never bothered to examine. Trusts that redirected, clauses that activated, obligations that followed the person who claimed ownership without understanding responsibility. By the time they stood in front of friends and family, exchanging vows and promises, I was already living elsewhere, in a space I had chosen for myself, emotionally and financially separate from the narrative they believed they controlled. I didn't attend the wedding. I sent a gift instead, something tasteful and symbolic, because closure doesn't require cruelty. And as they stepped into what they thought was victory, I stepped into freedom, knowing the consequences of their choices were already in motion, waiting patiently for the moment they would finally understand what they had underestimated. The understanding came slowly for them, the way consequences often do, quietly, then all at once. It started with small inconveniences they brushed off at first, accounts that required additional verification, payments that didn't process as expected, legal notices that arrived with language neither of them fully understood. My former husband called me once, his voice tight but polite, asking if I knew why certain funds were temporarily unavailable. I told him I wasn't sure and suggested he speak with his attorney. Linda didn't call at all. She sent messages instead, carefully worded, increasingly tense, asking if there had been a mistake. I responded kindly and briefly, never explaining, never correcting, because the truth didn't need my voice anymore. It was written into documents they had never bothered to read, agreements they had dismissed as routine. What they hadn't realized was that, while they were focused on romance and appearances, I had focused on structure, on permanence, on the difference between what feels owned and what actually is. The life they stepped into required maintenance they hadn't planned for, obligations they couldn't simply charm away. The confidence Linda carried so proudly at first began to crack under the weight of responsibility she had mistaken for reward. And my former husband, who had always believed he could talk his way through any complication, found himself facing systems that don't respond to persuasion. I didn't celebrate their struggle. I didn't interfere. I simply continued living my life with a steadiness that felt new and deeply earned. Because real revenge isn't about watching someone fall. It's about refusing to hold them up once you've stepped aside. By the time the full weight of their choices settled in, I had already grown accustomed to my new rhythm. Mornings were quieter, but not empty. I woke when I wanted to, drank my coffee slowly, read the news without interruption. The absence of constant emotional labor felt almost luxurious. I noticed changes in myself that surprised me, how my shoulders no longer tensed when the phone rang, how I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head before speaking. Meanwhile, fragments of their reality reached me through mutual acquaintances. Linda was adjusting, people said. My former husband was under a lot of stress. The language was always vague, softened to protect appearances. But stress has a sound to it, a look. I heard it in the clipped tone of his rare messages, saw it in the way people stopped mentioning their names altogether, as if silence could smooth over discomfort. I understood then that consequences don't need to be announced to be effective. They simply need time. What struck me most was not their struggle, but how invisible I had become to them once I was no longer useful. There were no apologies. No real attempts at accountability, only confusion that things hadn't gone according to plan. And that confusion was telling. It revealed how deeply they had believed I would always be available to absorb the impact of their decisions. But I had stepped out of that role completely. I wasn't watching from the sidelines, waiting for vindication. I was building a life that didn't include them at all. The peace I felt wasn't dramatic or triumphant. It was steady, grounded, and undeniable. And in that peace, I realized something that changed the way I viewed everything that had happened. The greatest shift hadn't been in their lives, it had been in mine. It was only later, much later, that I understood how deeply that shift mattered. Not just to me, but to the story itself. People often assume revenge looks like confrontation, like raised voices or public humiliation. They imagine it ends with someone on their knees, begging to be forgiven. But the truth is quieter and far more unsettling. Real reckoning happens when the person who once centered your life realizes they no longer exist in it at all. I stopped receiving updates. The messages slowed, then stopped. Invitations never came. My name was no longer mentioned in the same rooms where it once carried weight, and instead of feeling erased, I felt released. The woman I had been accommodating, patient, endlessly understanding, had served her purpose. She had carried a marriage longer than it deserved to last. Now she could rest. I began reconnecting with parts of myself I hadn't visited in years. I traveled alone for the first time, choosing destinations without compromise. I reconnected with friends I had quietly drifted away from while prioritizing a life that demanded my constant attention. And with each choice, I felt my identity solidify, not as someone's wife, someone's friend, someone's foundation, but as my own person, complete and intact. I didn't need closure from them because I had already given it to myself. And in that quiet certainty, I understood something profound. They hadn't taken anything from me that I couldn't rebuild. What they lost, however, was something far rarer, the trust of someone who once gave without keeping score. And that loss would follow them long after my story had moved on. I tell this story now not because I carry bitterness, but because I carry clarity. Time has a way of sanding down sharp edges, leaving behind only what matters. I don't replay conversations in my head anymore. I don't wonder what I could have done differently. I did what I was meant to do. I paid attention, I protected myself, and I chose dignity over drama. The woman I am today is not hardened by betrayal. She is refined by it. I learned that love without respect is just endurance, and endurance should never be mistaken for loyalty. I also learned that silence, when chosen intentionally, can be more powerful than any argument. My best friend and my former husband built a life on the assumption that I would quietly accept whatever was left for me. Instead, I left them with exactly what they earned: responsibility without my support. If you're listening to this and something in my story feels uncomfortably familiar, if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly replaced, know this: awareness is not weakness, and patience is not surrender. Sometimes the strongest move is the one no one sees coming. If this story resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe to this channel for more real, powerful stories like mine. And tell me in the comments, have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted deeply? Your voice matters here. Above all, remember this truth I learned too late, but now live by every day. Don't underestimate the power of women. And Happy New Year.